Radio Show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV Radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear.
Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your devotion to our station and to the truth. Today is Wednesday, February 24th, and as you know, on Wednesdays I interview activists and healers, and today it is my really great pleasure to bring back a personal friend of mine, Ed Osworth, who is the author of a book called Unstoppable Joy, which is also available on Amazon. Ed is here to share with us some of his information. I've known Ed for quite a long while now, and one of his hobbies is really digging into the dirt about Disney and how Disney affected our culture. We've had many conversations about the social engineering and why people are willing to, watch our current political system and listen to the people that are supporting Donald Trump, and it is just a shock to me as an individual to hear how people are just proud of their racism, proud of their bigotry. Hitler would be proud. Let's just put it to you that way. So anyways, I wanted to bring in Ed with us here today so that we can understand how did we get to this point. It's partly part of what I'm making this effort to dig into. So Ed, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Hey, so great to be back, Lonnie, and to cover a subject that really most people haven't touched at all or really even considered, and that is the relationship of Uncle Walt Disney, as I like to call him, in the molding not only of the consumer culture that America became, also the molding, specifically the molding of our acceptance of nuclear energy, in which he is the primary perpetrator, in my opinion, of why nuclear energy has been accepted in America, why they were able to build all of these nuclear plants carte blanche without anybody saying a second, there was no criticism, nothing. It was all gung-ho, man, we're going to go with nuclear power. And I'm kind of uniquely qualified to talk about this because of my age. When Walt Disney started really preparing the consumer culture, started going full steam ahead into we're going to get the public to accept nuclear and we're going to get the public to raise their expectations of how much they can consume, and at the same time show them that there's really no bad side effect of consuming everything in sight and raising your expectations. Well, it began in the mid-'50s with this television show, Walt Disney Presents, which later became The Wonderful World of Disney, which was pretty much the most popular television show on television for a decade. Started in 1955 when I was 5 years old. So basically, I grew up with the weekly episode of The Wonderful World of Disney.
Me too.
And I mean, he really was like an uncle. You saw him every week, you know. He's a really friendly guy.
Not only that,
you
he
remember?
stood for everything good in America. Like, I remember with pride thinking about how great Walt Disney was and what a you know, like, it was just like the most incredible thing, all the beautiful things that he brought to us. Like, I was a child. I grew up in California. You know, we used to go into Disneyland. That was the big treat. You know, we would get to go. When we were 10 years old, our parents took us to the Disneyland, and that was kind of like just that one-on-one time with our parent, right? And it was like the most beautiful, magnificent thing we'd ever seen in our. I mean, honestly, it was when I grew up and realized that Disney had a hand in shaping us. I felt very betrayed. So, talk to me. How did Disney get into this, and what message did he do, and how is it that we now live in a culture where people aren't even thinking? They're grateful that they don't have to think.
Well, and another part of it, especially with the nuclear issue, is how is it that we're in a culture where, you know, just last night, Johnson & Johnson had a verdict of $68 million put against them for giving one woman cancer because of talc powder, okay? And yet, everyone looks entirely away from the nuclear power industry and acts like, well, no, it couldn't be doing us any harm. And Walt had a lot to do with that. Let's go back to the very beginning. We've got a little time here, and I want, you know, I'm not going to go into the connections and really the business practices of Walt Disney because that's a whole other subject. I'm just going to go into kind of where he started and where he got his ideas. Most people don't know that actually Disney didn't get started making cartoons, but the cartoons he made was commercials for products. And after he made those for years, he got involved with an animation company that was essentially going belly up and kind of grabbed control of the place and started making cartoons for movies and got into the whole cartoon philosophy and everything by studying it. He wasn't really a natural artist that said, okay, started drawing pictures at 4 years old and goes, I'm going to be a cartoonist. No, he basically went and got an education on all of the methods, all of the psychology, everything else behind cartooning, and started making cartoons. At the same time, we had a person who you and I have discussed before, Edward Bernays, who wrote a couple of very important books. One was called Propaganda, and the other has the scariest title of any book I have ever seen a book title for, and that is The Engineering of Consent. Mm-hmm. What Edward Bernays basically believed was that what democracy really meant was that those with the wealth and power should gain control of the minds of those who didn't have the wealth and power so that we could form an orderly society. And Edward Bernays basically had a no-holds-barred attitude towards this. In other words, he studied Freud, he studied all the great psychologists, Jung, all of them, and took all of the button pushers that these psychologists had found and said, hey, how can we use all these to present something to society?
Yeah, but how does that work into Disney, though, Ed?
I'm just throwing Bernays in here because obviously Disney read and studied Bernays' books, because from the very first commercial success that Disney had, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, okay, you and I have discussed this, he developed a very specific color palette to trigger emotions in people. He also didn't follow the fairy tales that his stories were supposedly based on. He spun them off into his own direction about what the end message was going to be of the fairy tale. And, I mean, if you really look behind Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, if you look behind, the Sleeping Beauty, there's this underlying message of follow authority, stay in line, or bad things are going to happen.
Yeah, and if you're silent, you'll be rewarded. That's another
and
big one.
If you're silent, you'll be rewarded, exactly. And we won't even go into the feminism aspect, because that's a whole other ball of
Right.
wax. But, basically, I mean, and he programmed America so thoroughly that, maybe not in younger generations, but in my generation, people still, I'm looking for my Prince Charming. That's
Yeah, well,
totally a Disney expression.
women were not expected to be complete and whole partners in society. But let me ask you this, because what we're talking about Disney, Fantasia was a movie that was a big hit, or I think it was, but I never really quite got it. A lot of people really love that movie, but I have personally, I think that it has something to do. It was such an emotional movie. I couldn't figure out why it was considered a big hit or what they were doing.
Well, this is how funny. Boy, you're leading into where I was going to be leading into. This is great. So he creates Sleeping Beauty, or
and
Snow
Bambi,
White.
those stories,
his
Sleeping Beauty, Bambi, I can get, and I can see how they sort of manipulate people emotionally.
Right, right.
Who doesn't
So
remember Bambi's mom being killed in the fire, right? That, like every kid 6 years old was traumatized by that. But the Fantasia thing was considered a big hit, but I never understood it.
Well, we're going to go into that. And actually, Fantasia was a flop, and it's partially why Disney turned to the dark side, in my opinion. But let's go to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because there's several unique things about that movie and about how Disney did things besides the color palette. And that is, Snow White was the first movie ever that had toys that were released at the same time as the movie. Snow White was the first movie ever to have a soundtrack that was sold. Snow White was the first movie ever to connect merchandising with the movie, and the first cartoon character that was effectively merchandised, of course, was Mickey Mouse, with the Mickey Mouse watches. So immediately Disney realized there was this tie-in between the images he could put on the screen and how much money he could make. No one else had really tied those two things together. So he has this huge hit with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, walks away with Academy Awards, and goes off and thinks, I could do wrong. I'm going to create some more movies. So his next movie is Pinocchio, which also, think of the messages of Pinocchio. The Pinocchio really is intense about the messages of follow authority.
Right.
Or really horrible things are going to happen. And Pinocchio really was lukewarm with the audiences. It wasn't a home run at all like Snow White was. Then he poured a ton of money into, blending animation and live stuff to create Fantasia. This was all new technology. He was totally pushing technology to the end. And Fantasia was a complete flop. He had spent all of his money, all of his studio money, making Fantasia, and no one wanted it. The critics didn't like it. Nobody really liked it at the time at all. Mm-hmm. And so he recovered a little bit with Dumbo afterwards. And then Bambi came along, and Bambi actually wasn't that big of a hit when it came out in 1942. It became a bigger hit in subsequent release. And
so let's talk about this time frame, because the 1942, that was still during World War II. So but wait a minute,
there's something I need to introduce that proves that Disney's point was programming, and that was Disney was the only movie studio ever to re-release his films every 7 years. The reason being, Disney wanted his films exposed to every American child before the age of reason.
Did he say that intentionally? Well, did he write that down? Is that something that
He didn't write that down, but why was he the only studio to do that? No other studio did that. Once a film was shown, even an animation film, it was done. It was considered old material. We're done with it. Bye-bye.
So what leads you to believe that he was sort of a tool of the propaganda machine?
Well, this is what happened. He lost a bunch of money in the 40s, like you said. He had a string of flops in the 40s. World War II made everything tight. You couldn't get materials even to make film, because all of movies at that point, unless it was a propaganda film for the army, because, everything went to the war effort, okay? And even fuel, everything else, everything was rationed. So, at this point, Walt Disney isn't making a bunch of money. He has this giant studio that he bought in Burbank, and these deals become very great. This period of Disney in the late 40s becomes great. But what happens in this period is the Army takes over its entire studio. It is turned into an Army base. No other studio in Hollywood had that happen. And at the same time, they started developing nuclear bombs, and only one person was allowed to film our nuclear explosions. And that person happened to be Walt Disney, who at that time had developed the greatest special effects techniques, many of which were used in Fantasia of blending animation and live footage and creating photorealistic animation. So, do we know if all of this footage we saw of the atomic explosions was actually what was happening, or whether it was footage that was manipulated by Walt Disney Studios or the government to create the maximum dramatic effect?
Wait. So are you saying that the pictures of the bomb that we've seen taken out in the desert are actually just Disney making little tiny, making something?
Well, no, I think actually the explosions, the big giant mushroom cloud explosions, which actually can be created with phosphorus bombs done a certain way, but I think those explosions were absolutely real. As far as buildings disintegrating and jeeps flying around and all of that stuff, as all of us have ever wondered, how did the cameras survive?
Well, weren't they far enough away?
No, they didn't have really super sensitive telephoto lenses in the 50s. The official story is that they built the cameras in super protected bunkers, with ultra thick glass, yada, 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 yada. But the truth is, I think what happened, I'm not saying that the films were faked. They shot nuclear bombs off. That's why we all got irradiated. But I think what they did is they said, we want to scare the Russians as much as possible. So we want your studio to work on these films. You know how to make people be emotional. Even the timing of the nuclear explosion films is very, very carefully calculated, the segue from image to image. Mm-hmm. Okay? So you take care of these films, you make them scare the hell out of everybody, and we're going to keep the studio going. We're going to keep you going really good, and we'll probably even help you build this Disneyland thing that everybody says is such a stupid idea. So here we go. We're at 1950 basically now. The war's ending.
Wait a minute. Let me just stop you there. So that's an interesting juxtaposition. You're saying that you think that Walt Disney, with the use of the government contracts, was able to fund his big dream of building Disneyland? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it needed two things. It needed the government contracts, plus it needed him to accept television, which he hated. But they wanted him on television every week to do their work.
Who is they?
I would say the military establishment, which at that time was very, very polluted with Nazis that they brought over from Germany, one of which went to work, who happened to be a nuclear scientist, and I've shown you, went to work for Walt Disney.
And who is that?
That paperclip German nuclear scientist who introduces our friend the atom.
So you're saying that you believe that the military, right near the end of World War II, began to fund Disney and use him as a propaganda tool? Is that basically the gist of what you're saying here?
Yes, I do. Yes, you're synopsizing it perfectly. I believe that Disney basically, in order to keep his studio alive, in order to be able to go forward with his plans after having a string of flops. It's very interesting because the film he made in 1942 was Bambi. The next film he made in 1944 was Victory Through Air Power, a total 70-minute military propaganda film. And then, worse yet, 1943, he made Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros, both of which were basically, we're going to take over South America, and we're calling it the Friendly Neighbor Program.
Huh.
You remember those?
No, I never saw those films. And tell me, what were they?
They're very, you can't see. Basically, it's Donald Duck, and then it's a South American version of Donald Duck who plays Tico Tico, and is a South American, and it's about how the South Americans are all our great friends. It was called the Good Neighbor Program, okay? And basically, it was when we were taking over every banana republic.
Wow.
And Disney put the smiley face on it.
Yeah, I'm beginning to understand exactly what you're saying here, because that is around the time when Americans, I mean, I grew up, really, to be honest, this is shocking. I grew up believing that South Americans were all illiterate, that nobody had an education.
Well, that's what that's what, Saludos Americanos, like, look at these silly, laid-back people down here. They don't do anything but eat bananas and play Tico Tico all the time.
Right. Right.
Right?
Well, I do know that on the Disney show every single week, of which our family of 8, we all sat there and were just glued to the television every single week. When we got a television by the mid-'60s, we did.
Oh, yeah. No, we too. I mean, and by that time, he was churning out hits again, which is very interesting. The other movie I have to mention that he made during this famous period of the late 40s, which you can't even find because it's so offensive it can't be released, it's Song of the South.
Yeah, I remember seeing that.
So, in other words, it's very interesting. He made these movies. Disney Studios floated through this period. At that time, he had an ongoing contract to shoot all of the nuclear tests, and you know how many they did in the early 50s. They were shooting those babies off every week.
Well, look at this. Check this out, Ed. This is the thing. I know for a fact that when all the Disney Mouseketeers, like I knew one of the Mouseketeers as an adult, she was still required by Disney to go to Disney events, which is why I think we have this young girl, Miley Cyrus, like being so vulgar and so rude that Disney wants nothing to do with her. That was the only way she could get away from them. That's what I think.
Well, I have read most of the biographies of Walt Disney, and I'm glad you mentioned this because I forgot this in my notes. Walt Disney is remembered as a creative genius, and which he is. But what Walt Disney is not remembered as is a cult leader, which he was. The techniques that he used with his employees mirror cult control techniques. I will just give you one. Any autobiography you read about Walt Disney, at one point you read about the time the employee met with Walt Disney and how Walt Disney told him or her they were the most important person in the organization.
Right.
That is textbook cult control.
Well, so Ed, what proof do you have? Do you have any proof at all that Disney was funded at all by the propaganda machine, by the U.S.
Well, yes,
government?
because he got paid to do all those films. He got paid. He didn't do the nuclear movies for free, and nobody knows how much he got paid to do those.
Oh, you mean our friend
the
Adam was...
He didn't give the studio. He didn't give the studio. He didn't give the studio to the military for free. They had to pay him to use it. So basically, a lot of what I'm doing is conjecture based on my study, as I said. So now we have Walt Disney coming out of the 50s, and you just introduced the linchpin, our friend the Atom. Our friend the Atom, let me tell you, folks, if you're listening to this show and you have not gone to YouTube and looked up Our Friend the Atom and watched it, you must. Our Friend the Atom is the most effective nuclear power propaganda ever created. It is an hour-long show that was shown at least once a year, usually twice a year, on The Wonderful World of Disney. And it's admitted, even by the military gave him the contract to make Our Friend the Atom because after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people didn't really think atoms were nice things. And the nuclear power industry said, we got to put a smiley face on this if we're going to be able to build these reactors all over the country.
And
so they went to Walt Disney.
Thinking about the bomb. That's really the issue.
Exactly. So they went to the same guy who filmed all the nuclear explosions and put an ugly face on those and said, hey, we need you to create this film, and we're going to give you a nuclear engineer that we just brought over from Germany so that you'll be the expert on nuclear science. They were so involved and many people don't realize this, but this is factual. Originally, the plans for Disneyland, Tomorrowland, was going to be a nuclear reactor.
Say that again?
Originally, Tomorrowland, in the original plans for Disneyland, the section of Disneyland called Tomorrowland, where they built the rocket ship,
yeah,
they were going to build a nuclear reactor there that people could walk through.
Oh, my God.
That was in the original plan.
And how did that come out of that original plan? How did that end up?
They had that scientist, that German scientist, I should have his name here, but that German scientist who introduces our friend the atom, basically convinced him that it might not be a good idea.
Good idea. No, probably not a good idea to put a nuclear reactor right in the middle of a theme park.
So in any case, our friend the atom basically paints this unreal picture of nuclear power that every American, the influence of Walt Disney on at least white middle-class America. I didn't grow up in a ghetto, so I don't really know, okay? But on white middle-class America, the influence on Disney cannot be understated. And our friend the atom basically told the entire population that our entire future was going to be atomic. Our health care, even your cars, were going to be powered by atomic engines. Your motorboat, everything was going to be powered by atomic engine, and none of us were really going to have to work.
Right.
Because there was going to be all of this power, and it was going to be free, and literally drew this fantasy world of how we were going to look in 20 or 30 years with all the benefits of nuclear power. And at that point, at our friend the atom, which you and I laughed at the end, is almost scary to watch, because they were intending to irradiate all the soil they grew our plants in.
Well, they have actually irradiated all the soil.
Well, they did succeed it, but they didn't do it above floor.
They have actually, mission accomplished on that one. The scientist, the physicist, the German physicist, his name was Heinz Haber, Haber.
Thank you.
Yeah, he was a professor at USC and a personal science consultant.
He became a professor?
Yes.
Holy! So he trained all these people that you are going, how come they don't see anything? That's very interesting.
That is actually the number one thing that I have really noticed in many of the stories. Like I highlighted a story last week on my YouTube channel about this gentleman, a young scientist, nuclear scientist from Canada, who basically said iodine 129 is not harmful because it dissipates in 2 or 3 days or something like that, or so many hours. It's a very short-lived thing. But the key is whether there's iodine 129 on the list of isotopes is after all these other isotopes have decayed. It's a long list, and along with iodine 129 is all the other isotopes. So you can't, in theory, from Fukushima say, oh, well, if we see iodine 129, it's not harmful. It's the twisting of how these nuclear scientists go, and it's exactly how these...
Well, you and and this is why I really would like your listeners to watch our friend the atom, because I want them to look for a phrase that does not show up in that film. And remember, this was the primary education most Americans got on nuclear power, how it worked, how it was affecting the world, that most Americans got up until the late 60s. And the phrase you will not find anywhere in that film is nuclear waste. It does not exist.
Yeah, they never talked about it like that. They created
it. Does not exist. So we were sold nuclear power literally that had no bad side effects, no negative thing attached to it at all. Is it any surprise that Americans were going, sure, build them?
Yeah. Well, they told us that the atom is our future, that the atom is our friend. You know what I mean? And we were told over and over again that we are not scientists, so we are not to question the scientists because it's so in. This is the whole issue.
Well, actually, our friend the atom has a very unique analogy in it, and it's almost like Disney knew that it wasn't all good by the analogy he used, because our friend the atom, the whole film is based around the analogy of the good genie and the bad genie. And this was a great way to separate Hiroshima out, because the bad genie was the explosion over Hiroshima, the explosion over a city, okay? And the good genie was the smoke coming out of the nuclear plant, okay? So he starts up the story about how the fisherman outsmarts the genie, the old fisherman in the genie tale, and he traps him back in the bottle, and then the genie bows to him and says, "I'm going to give you witches." So that's the
their
good
second
genie.
wish, food and health.
Right, right. But unfortunately, I mean, and I'm sure Disney had to be aware of this because he was a great historian and great researcher. In any of the real stories about genies, which are actually called gems in the Middle East, okay, you never make a deal with them. It never works out for you. In the end, you suffer and cry.
Well,
there's no good genie. There's no bad genie. They're all bad for you.
Well, the third wish was peace, right? So, I mean, he made a bunch of wishes out of that third.
Oh, it was beautiful. It was beautiful how he did it.
I mean, the whole thing was really about teaching us to just ignore what our common sense was telling us. And that's in fact where we're at today. Like right now, we have what's going on up at Indian Point, and we have St. Louis. I mean, Helen Caldecott.
And I heard the governor won't demand to shut it down.
Well, the governor is actually Governor Cuomo is actually doing some efforts, but his efforts are being squashed, and this is the whole thing. I mean, Helen Caldecott was dumbfounded when she saw St. Louis over the weekend. She was like, in all of her life, she said she had never seen such a contaminated site, and with the American government sitting right next to it, like, she's like, what's the government thinking? These people need to be moved immediately. And then she said exactly what I said. The people need to be moved immediately, and then they can deal with the waste. The number one priority is getting those people away from this contaminated site. And this is the whole thing about the friendly atom and the peaceful atom and acting like it's not that big a deal. It is a catastrophic event, as she said in her symposium. The latency period for radiation is 4 to 80 years. 80 years. Not just 10 years, 20 years. It can be up to 80 years. So you could get cancer, but in the meantime of you getting cancer or any of these other diseases, you're passing that along in your genes. And she said we had previously thought it was 3 to 4 generations where you would start seeing the negative effects of the radiation. But she said, actually, it could be up to 10, 12 generations. Because it doesn't show up until each parent can carry a mutated gene, but until they produce together, that's when they create the mutation. So it's kind of a mix of when will it show up. It's a Russian roulette of human destruction.
Okay, now you were asking if there's proof regarding Disney getting money from the government. I'm going to read you a couple of paragraphs off Wikipedia. Mm-hmm. The World War II era. Shortly after Disney released Dumbo in October 1941, the U.S. entered World War II. At that point, the U.S. Army and Navy Bureau of Aeronautics contracted most of the Disney Studios facility, where the staff created training and instruction films for the military, like aircraft carrier landing signals, home front morale-boosting shorts such as Die Fuhrer's Face, and the 1943 feature film Victory Through Air Power. Military films did not generate income and did not need to, as income was guaranteed through the government. Bambi underperformed in 1942, and in 1945, The Three Caballeros was the last animation feature released by the studio during the war. But in 1941, the U.S. State Department sent Disney and a group of animators to South America as part of its good neighbor policy, at the same time guaranteeing financing for the resulting movie, Saludos Amigos. In addition, Disney was asked by the U.S. Office of Coordination and Inter-American Affairs to make an educational film about the Amazon basin. Okay, now let's go forward to 1957 when everybody thought the Red Scare was over. Disney was the founding member of the anti-communist group Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. In 1947,
that's because he didn't want to become a target of McCarthy.
In 1947, during the Second Red Scare, Disney testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, where he branded Herbert Sorrell, Dave Hiberman, and William Pomerantz, former animators of his and labor union organizers, as communist agitators.
Wow, really?
He also accused the Screen Cartoonist Guild of being a communist front, and charged that the 1941 strike led by them was part of an organized communist effort to gain all the influence in Hollywood.
Wow. So he basically...
In 55, Disney was approved. This is interesting. This is the linchpin, and I didn't even know this, reading his biography. On January 12, 1955, Disney was approved by the Federal Bureau of Investigation as an official special agent in charge.
Yeah, well, he's a special agent in charge, all right. So
this designation was used in-house by the Bureau for a trusted person they could contact for any information or further assistance on anything. The memos indicate that he remained a reliable source of information for the FBI to his death.
To his death. So that means that while we were watching Uncle Walt every Sunday, he was really an FBI agent. Is that what you're telling us?
Yes. He was officially an FBI agent. And now let's get to the interesting part, his death. How many men have really succeeded in promoting the nuclear industry after their death? And I believe Walt Disney was one of them. Because he died actually when Our Friend the Atom was still being shown every year. Okay? And he became the poster child for a brand new disease that nobody knew about. And that disease was lung cancer. Mm-hmm. Our beloved Uncle Walt was taken from us at the prime of his creativity because he smoked too much. Now, a very interesting thing to have fun with is to go out on the internet and try and find pictures of Walt Disney smoking or films of Walt Disney smoking, because this chain smoker, amazingly, was almost never had a cigarette in his hand.
Ed, but I recall when he was on that show, didn't he used to smoke on his show?
He would smoke occasionally. But I'm saying a chain smoker, especially in unstaged shots, like when he's at Disneyland and things like that, a chain smoker would generally have.
So what are you saying?
No evidence. What I am saying is lung cancer was unknown. Walt Disney was the most known person in America in the mid-'60s when he died of lung cancer. Life magazine put him on the cover, and it was major, major news. And then we got all the articles about you're killing yourself with cigarettes. This culminated in, the stuff in the early 70s with the cigarettes having to put the death warning labels on it. Mm-hmm. But if you go, we have smoked cigarettes for 400 years now. And yes, a lot of those times there weren't good medical records. But even if you go to the medical records, say from the 1900s, where medical records were actually pretty good, and try to trace lung cancer, you find out something really amazing. And that is, it didn't really start happening until 1955, 1956, when, amazingly enough, background radiation started being everywhere.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. So it's maybe a switch and bait, that whole thing, so that we're not
looking at the cause. Not a switch and bait. I'm sure cigarettes are maybe the majority involved, but I'm kind of thinking that this might be the case with other cancers as well, that maybe it's a combination of a reaction that, because as you know, and as you've said so many times on your show, even a tiny bit of background radiation causes mutation.
Well, I do know this, too, that the cigarettes that we're smoking that cause the cancer, there's been some research that where it's not actually the tobacco, it's all the chemicals and all the additives that are giving us the cancer.
Well, no, and it's been like that a long time. And I mean, and I'm not saying there's any evidence of that, but I'm often wondered, why did they make him such a poster child for this mental disease?
Well, look, this whole thing about the switch and bait, it's that 90% rule, and I keep coming back to that. John Goffman basically studied the people of Japan for 20 years, and when he really looked at, he was mortified that the U.S. military had destroyed a major portion of their evidence about the studies they did after World War II. So he studied the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for 20 years. And at the end of it, he basically said the United States government, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the International, and the AEC, which is now the NRC, the Atomic Energy Commission of the United States, and the U.S. government basically underreport the negative effects of radiation by 90% and deny that radiation causes harm. I call that the 90% rule. They are still sticking to it now.
Let's tie it to the story yesterday with Johnson & Johnson getting fined $68 million because for their baby powder, talc powder, And basically what was proven in the trial is that Johnson & Johnson had been lying for decades to both the government regulators and, of course, consumers about this. They had full knowledge of this. What makes anyone think the nuclear industry is any different?
Right. Well, what's different about the nuclear industry is they have a rule on the books that says nobody goes to jail. That's what makes them different. Nobody goes
Very
to
true.
jail.
They won't even get I don't even think we can get a $68 million fine against the nuclear industry.
No, what will happen
As you know, I've tried to contact lawyers, and it's almost ridiculous.
No, what will happen, Ed, is that we will end up paying the bill. There was a story I posted on Facebook yesterday. A nuclear power facility, I forget where, but a nuclear power facility basically said to us that, they had huge fines, and I think it was there was a call coming in. They had a huge fine of something like $32 million or something, but the government is going to waive it because it's going to affect their bottom line profit. So they're not going to impose any penalties on this nuclear power facility that's been leaking and lying to the government about the radiation. This is the point of it all, though, Ed. This is how we, especially with the Walt Disney mentality in the era of Disney, and let's all just be entertained and ignore the elephant in the room of we are being poisoned by these technologists. And people say, well, we need nuclear energy. We need to have it because it's an alternative form. What they don't understand is that we don't need nuclear energy, and we haven't even dealt with the mess that we've got going on. Ask the people of St. Louis or the people in New York. I mean, or the people down, this whole thing. Now, I want to get back to this thing about Disney because I can go off on a rant about where we're at, but how is it that Disney was specifically targeted? Why did they go to Disney? Have you ever been able to figure out that one? Why did they go to Disney?
I can kind of tell you just through supposition why they went to Disney, because he is a genius. He was a genius. What he did with films, tying in marketing, manipulating people's emotions. Yeah, I mean, Disney and pretty much the whole government was a follower of Bernays. I mean, so they obviously saw that this man understood the psychology, understood how to get reactions out of audiences, understood how to present information in a way that could basically turn black into white. Basically what he made was propaganda. I mean, all those films he made for the military, those are basically all, paid propaganda that he made.
Well, not only that, but his weekly television shows, how many of us don't remember that are older, remember the Johnny Appleseed, the whole lie about we're coming across America and we're going to be friends with the Native Americans and life was good. Right. And there was really no discussion about the horror and the terror of how America became a gigantic nation. It was really based on murder, death, kill. You know what I mean? Like it was just...
And people don't... and even the stuff we relied on, you remember these because these are, almost every movie you went to, even if you didn't see a Disney film, they had a little Disney nature short, remember?
Right.
And all those nature shorts were lies. They scripted them ahead of time.
Right.
The animals had to do what they wanted them to do, or they were to force those damn animals to do what they wanted them to do.
Well, that brings up another point about how the movie industry has really manipulated us. You and I recall when we were kids, when we used to go to the movies, we didn't have to watch 20 minutes of commercials. We basically
if you paid, you didn't watch any commercials.
Yeah,
maybe one.
You watch 2 or 3 cartoons so the people could get settled in and settled down. That's what the cartoons were about. You get in, you get settled in and settled down, and then you watched your movie. But, we have transitioned into a culture where we go to the movies, and for the first 20 minutes, we know we're going to be bombarded with commercials. So, and
so we pay to be advertised to.
Right. Exactly. And there's nothing that we can do to say, it's kind of like when you walk, when you go into Disneyland or into Disney World, which in my view is a frightening place, you lose all of your rights. You have no rights.
Oh, absolutely. Well, when Walt Disney Many people don't realize this. A couple of interesting things about Walt Disney, which I was thrown out of or I barred admission many times because I had long hair in the 60s. And that is, the reason they could do that is Walt Disney is its own city. It is its own government. It is its own county. It's the county and city of Disneyland. So because of that, they have their own police departments, their own judges, their own legal system, like the Vatican, interestingly enough. So, and the other thing about Disneyland in the early 60s, and, this is a different company, but actually not a different company, because Monsanto was one of the companies that that worked with the Manhattan Project, as you're well aware. Everywhere in Disneyland were signs that said, Monsanto, better living through chemistry. The other signs that were in Disneyland were General Electric. Progress is our most important product. I remember those signs. I remember the slogans on them. That's how much they impressed me. It was all about the future. Monsanto financed half of Disney. The House of the Future was made by Monsanto. Monsanto's Journey into the Inner World of the Atom was by Monsanto.
Well, it's it's the whole idea of these theme parks, going to these theme parks and, quote, being entertained and having this stuff shoved down your throat. And, you go into these places and you're like, it's the whole idea of, as Americans, as people of, quote, leisure time, we have, it's our right to, like, go in and have some leisurely time without regard to the harm we're causing to the rest of the world. That is, I think, one of the biggest, hardest parts about what happened.
I don't know if you've ever read this kind of perspective on the amusement parks, but I read a great commentary where the gentleman was talking about how the amusement parks are how we compartmentalize the poor. In other words, we go to Disneyland and I'm tired of Tomorrowland. I want to go over to Frontierland. Right? Seen enough of Tomorrowland. Seen enough of Fantasyland. Well, I've seen enough of Poor People Land. We compartmentalize society like a giant amusement park.
Time to move on. Yeah. Well, look what's going on with the Dumb and Dumber show right now. I mean, we are in a place in our country where really people are waking up. I mean, I think this is the good news of the whole thing is it's gotten so bad that people are waking up, but the question is, how do we corral that new consciousness of, holy crap, we've been sold down the river, and how do we take it back? I think this is the big question in our current election. We have people who don't believe that whether we vote or not anything will change. We have people who believe that one side or the other, like the quote radicals, which is really hilarious that people would compare Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, but they do compare them because they're both opposite ends of the spectrum for anti-establishment candidates. And then we have the establishment candidates who everybody says, oh my God. So we're in this place of really seriously being like battered wild.
I agree. And as you know, I was an activist during the 60s and even had the FBI after me because of that. And I have to, and I hate to sound like the old geezer, but I really do have to compare what being an activist meant in the 60s compared to what being an activist means now. And remember, we brought 1 million people to Washington, D.C. physically, without Facebook, without Twitter, without any social networking whatsoever.
Helen Caldicott got 1 million people in the streets of New York to stop nuclear.
Yay! And, this is what we need, because being an activist meant you went to an event expecting to be arrested. That's what being an activist meant. That was when you went, okay? And the reason you went expecting to be arrested, and you realized it, is because the police can only arrest so many people.
Right. Well, you know what?
So if everybody's willing to be arrested, guess what happens? The cops get overwhelmed.
Well, Ed, that was in the old days. What happened during the Occupy movement was people were disappeared for 3 to 4 weeks at a time. I know. Disappeared, which is the serious Hitler-style attitude that happened during the Occupy.
Well, look what happened to Megan Rice. I mean, for those who aren't familiar, tell people what happened to Megan.
Yeah, Megan Rice, what'd she do? She did a very small, peaceful protest at an illegal facility that was processing nuclear material, and she and the Plowshare activists, 2 of them, basically went in, broke through with their own cutters. They went to jail for 3 years because they chipped a little dent of concrete off the base of it to make a point, and they pasted with infants' blood on the nuclear power plant, nuclear kills. And so they were considered terrorists, and they spent 3 years in jail. Thankfully,
and how old was Megan? How old was Megan?
She was 64 years old when she went to jail. And our government had no problem putting an elderly nun in jail. And you notice we have not heard from her really publicly since she's been out, and that's probably one of the terms of her release was that she cannot.
Oh, I'm sure.
Just like
silencing people is the norm now, and as I recall from that incident, didn't they have to? They were expecting to be arrested, but nobody showed up, even though they totally broke into security. So they had to like notify people that we broke into your facility.
Well, look, this is the thing. This thing with Disney, and it's really the whole thing with Disney is how it got started. But what I am really fascinated with these days is not just how Disney got started, but the way we just accept it as if it's the norm, as if it's like we. I mean, I actually feel sorry for Cyrus.
For one thing, I mean, I know we only have a few minutes, but for one thing, let's stop revering this man. Okay, I mean, you don't revere Goebbels. Goebbels was a genius, just like Disney. Pretty much the same sort of guy, but, we can't worship these people that lied to us or paid.
Yeah. Well, not only lied, but he bought the propaganda. He believed that he was creating a more perfect world. That's the scary part about, and in fact, that's the scary part about a lot of the propagandists. Like these people think that, we have to have these things. They're so bought. It's like Brad Yates said, they don't just wake up in the morning and say, we're going to be evil. They believe that what they're doing, that they have a right, and that they think that they're doing the right thing. What they can't see behind is the gaslighting and the propaganda machine that they've all been bought into.
Another suggestion to listeners is go do a little bit of research into Edwin Bernays, maybe read Propaganda or one of his books, because the attitude that Lonnie is talking about is exactly what he espouses. There's the people that are successful, mega successful people in business, and the people that raise themselves up in society like celebrities, and then there's the little people. And the little people are just to be manipulated to do what's best for the good of society.
Well, and let's get clear about this. These people that raise themselves up in society are raised up intentionally. The people that move, like the Kardashians, Kanye West, those are intentionally moved up. They have been.
I agree with you.
We're manipulated by their so-called, celebrity.
I may offend people with this statement, but you remember these. I compare the giant hip-hop phenomena, Kanye West and everything else, to the blaxploitation films of the 1970s.
I think that's too simplistic. I disagree with that. Because,
it's the same thing behind it. It's a way of taking a segment of the population and going, we're really you.
Well,
so believe it.
I have a lot of feelings about that because I happen to be a big fan of Tupac Shakur, and I know some hip hop artists, and I know that this.
And I'm not saying the whole phenomenon, but you also know the manipulative side of the other, and that's not Tupac, and that's not a lot of the people out there. And I agree with you on that.
Well,
I don't want to lump everybody into one lump.
Well, look, the whole thing is about really, they manipulate every single segment of our society, and it did start with Uncle Walt. I mean, really, honestly, we bought it with and sinker. Like with Walt Disney, it's almost sacrosanct to say anything against him. When I do know for a fact that when you work for Disney, or at least that's how it used to be, if you said anything negative about Disney, you would get fired. You could not. It was really a very kind of a Nazi-esque regime to work for. And this thing with
which is you brought up earlier, it's very hard for me to believe that Britney Spears and the other people that originated in the Disney stable are not connected. All of their behavior is not connected to what they want the public to see. Because as you know, and you just mentioned this, and I grew up in Hollywood, when you sign a contract with Disney, it's a lifelong contract.
Yes. And that is not unintentional. That's not unintentional. But
No.
this whole thing about the friendly atom, like the whole key, and it was very effective at getting us to not pay attention to the harm that it's caused. And frankly, people don't. It's been kind of hard for me to really highlight what's going on in St. Louis, because I think many of the people in St. Louis, they genuinely really were dumbfounded when they really realized that the government is not going to help the government's not going to take responsibility for the harm that they've caused, because really they have done nothing. And the waste in St. Louis needs to be moved yesterday. But the people in St. Louis who live within 5 miles or 10 miles need to be moved last year. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, that's just outrageous that there's people living there, and we're watching children just fall off like flies, like children are getting cancer. And yet we live in a culture that's nobody's even talking about St. Louis on mainstream media. That does not even hit. Maybe 1 or 2 articles on Washington Post here or there, but on the talk box, not one word has been mentioned about harm.
I scanned this morning, and I agree with you. It's all, well, and the story about Johnson & Johnson getting fined $68 million yesterday, try and find that.
Yeah, well, that's the other dirty little secret about all these fines, isn't it, Ed? When you have these big, gigantic fines, they get negotiated down. So people don't actually get those big multi-billion.
Oh, no one's going to get that $68 million, and you and I know it because Johnson & Johnson's lawyers will pull maneuvers from now to forever. Till the people die.
That's kind of what they do, and that is really so. I mean, this whole thing it is up to us. I often say this: it's up to us. This is on our watch. This is why I do this radio show 3 times a week. This is why I do a lot of the research behind nuclear, and I pay attention to the hidden messages that they're saying to us, because honestly, as adults, we have a responsibility to start shaking it up in our culture with other adults and give them the courage to face this, because it is overwhelming. Can you imagine it when young people really wake up? But the adults in our culture are actually abdicating their responsibility. We ought to have.
Well, one of the I want to get this in before they cut us off. One of the oldest expressions, wise expressions around, is "fool me once, you're the fool. Fool me twice, I'm the fool." Why do people continue to believe statements from proven liars? Right. Why?
Well, it's the gaslighting. The thing is, it's not about who's a liar and who's not a liar, because people don't. They're like, they've been conditioned to believe, well, they're all liars. Well, they're not all liars, but what happens is all the liars lie all the time. So it's really hard to figure out who's telling the truth. So, Ed, we are at 8:57. We have about a minute and a half left. So I wanted to give you this opportunity. If there's anything that we didn't cover about this Disney that you could squeeze in a minute, is there anything?
Well, no, I think we did a good job. As I said, the one thing I want to mention to people, if you really want to understand how we've been programmed, there's nothing better you could go do than read even part of a copy of one of Edward Benet's books, because this is the man who they really structured our entire consumer society based on his teachings.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was really all about mind control, and Disney was definitely a big manipulator of all of that, And for them, it was like them fulfilling the American dream. That was part of the American dream for us to sit down and shut up. So it is time for us, though, to.
But we're waking up.
And not only just wake up, we cannot just wake up. We have to get active, and we really do have to pressure our elected officials. We have to put our bodies on the line. We have to start putting ourselves in the street, and we have to demand an end to the nuclear lies. So we are at 8:58. We have 15 seconds left. Thank you, Ed Osworth, for joining us this morning and discussing what's gone on with the whole Disney lies. Thank you to my listeners for listening to my radio show. We'll have a call-in Friday on Friday. Put your courage feet on, and thank you for joining us. And, take action whenever you can.